Delighted to have you here. We've got a great session lined up for you too, with an excellent panel today as well. The session is using immersive learning to inform your talent strategy. We'll be talking about that and getting the insights of Ryan O'Rourke, who's the Chief Revenue Officer at Skillwell. And as his guest, we have Al Dia. Al, you may be familiar with, has done a number of webinars for us. And we want to twist his arm and have him back too. He's the founder of The Edge of Work. And then we have Natalia Yusupova and Natalia is the AVP for Talent and Learning at Ochsner Healthcare System. So welcome to everybody here and to our panelists. I'm Gary Van Antwerp. If you don't know me, I'm the producer of the webinar series and I run Training Magazine Network. I'm so glad to have you all here. If I can help you, send me a private chat. You can click that little silhouette icon in the chat next to the happy face there icon, and I'll be happy to. We have a lot going on. I've arranged probably about 90 webinars already for the new year. But coming up in just the next few days, starting tomorrow, will be another panel. Garima Gupta, whom many of you know, will have as her guest Rance Green and Christy Tucker to talk about designing for human and storytelling and scenarios. Okay, and then Megan Torrance will be back, and Nolan Hames. Many of you know Nolan. He's going to be talking about keeping control of your masters and formatting and consistency in your PowerPoint decks and your Franken decks. So we've got a lot of great things lined up for you, and I hope you can join us for all of those. We are sponsored today by a new sponsor. Now, you might know ETU. ETU sponsored us in the past, but today ETU has become Skillwell, and Skillwell is our sponsor for the session today. You can click on this slide. I'll put it back up later on, and it'll take you to skillwell.com. I hope you get a chance to jump over there and see how Skillwell can help you. Right now, we're going to go ahead and get started with using immersive learning to inform your talent strategy. And for that, I'd like to welcome Ryan O'Rourke. Ryan's going to lead us off. And Al, if you'll turn on your camera, then we'll have all three of you here. Ryan, you can introduce Natalia and Al.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you, everybody, for taking some time out of your busy schedules to attend today. We're really looking forward to this conversation and, getting all of your perspectives in the chat. I know we've got a couple people from the Skillwell team that'll be answering questions, and we'll try to catch some questions along the way. Really looking forward to this. We're going to keep it pretty conversational and get a lot of great insights. So I'd like to welcome Al and Natalia to the conversation today. Natalia is actually one of our customers with Skillwell. So we've been working together for a little over a year and a half. And many of you know Al already. And, he's somebody who brings a lot of insight and I think is going to add quite a bit to this discussion, as the founder of The Edge of Work, really, as we talk a lot about, using immersive learning to inform your talent strategies. So Al, Natalia, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. I'm actually going to kick things off for a question for everybody to have in the chat. And just want to get a little bit of a sense check here, and feel free to, answer. Go ahead. Does your company already use immersive learning as part of your talent strategy? So I think that's something I'm always curious about. And, when we talk about immersive learning, that can mean a few different things to different people, but really is, we'll keep it more broad based as far as putting people in a situation that they would face in their job, just keep it there. So it looks like, kind of immediate yeses and nos, a little bit of everything. So whether it's a simulation on the job, anything like that. I don't know, Al, from your perspective, what percentage of companies out there do you think are using immersive learning today?
It's such a good question. First off, I would say I feel like every week that goes by, that number ekes up maybe a little bit. So on the directional, it's probably increasing. Okay. I think the other thing I think about before I actually answer the question is I bet many people are actually using this or have, even if they're not using it, are probably actually using it in their personal life in some way,
Sure.
in some kind of capacity. So with those two kind of grounding points, I'd probably say somewhere between 30 or 40%. That would be my guess. But I think the other thing is knowing the audience of this this webinar, it might be a little bit higher, I would say, than the average per se, just because of,
Sure.
and so I'd probably put this audience probably like, somewhere between 50 to 60, if not maybe more than that. So, but on the whole, I would say it's definitely increasing. I just think we're at a point now where, I think for a long time, some people were using it on the fringes and the margins, but just with how pervasive technology has become today, and also how scalable it really has become, I think that number is just starting to increase and come up. And there's a reason why there's a lot of people who are signed up to come to a webinar like this, right? If you would have asked me, if we were to have done this 10 years ago, there'd probably be a lot smaller number. So.
No, I think you're right. And Natalia, obviously working in healthcare, I know immersive learning is a big part of, kind of how you would train people just really across the board. So obviously you do work with us, but I would think that it's a big piece of your strategy just as a whole.
I think so. And I think immersive learning has been around for many, many years. I mean, in healthcare, you think of sim labs and things like that. They've been around, it's just different technology. I think with latest technology, we just see a spike of different things developing. It allows us to move so fast, implementing things and building up skills that were before very difficult to track and build in the regular class. So
definitely. All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and move on here. And so, when I think about what is the challenge for this audience, right? What is the L&D talent? And when we're kind of using business problem, that's very broad. Obviously, not everyone's a business. You could be working somewhere in healthcare, you could be working at a university. There's a lot of different areas, but there's a problem that's identified, and it's kind of put on to the L&D to roll out some training to solve the problem. And after this happens, there's kind of the retrospective, okay, what happened, right? Did the problem get solved or did it not get solved? What's the verification? How do we map the training that we did to the actual outcome that's there? And, that's something I see even at the CLO level. People will ask questions, okay, how do we prove this was the training that happened? And, as technology changes, and, you both kind of mentioned it, expectations are that you're going a lot faster with this. And so, it's not, we've identified the problem and I want the L&D team, kind of training on this next week. And so I think this is a pretty big challenge. I don't know, I guess, I saw you both nodding when I talked about just the speed of technology. Al, does that seem to resonate, I guess, in your world as far as what expectations look like for L&D teams?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I think it's a couple things to, your point in terms of, even how this slide is architected. I think for a long time, collectively, we've known that while some type of learning intervention like training could be the solution, it isn't always the solution or the only solution, right? Particularly when you're trying to either target some kind of outcome like a behavioral change of either, doing a new thing, not doing something, or, doing some type of activity better. And so I think there's always been a challenge in terms of, to your point, of really being able to draw kind of that connective tissue or through line between all of those components. But, when we do identify that it is a good opportunity to use some kind of intervention like a training or learning to be able to close that gap or to be able to exhibit that behavior, we've often relied on things that I think we all have probably participated in some way, shape, or form in the past, in terms of, some kind of program or some kind of job aid or some kind of in-person kind of role play or something like that. And I think one of the things to me that sometimes is hard is two things. Number one, how do you design something in a way that is actually personalized to meet the individual where they are, so they actually can feel challenged and start to really build whatever that skill or behavior or whatever you want to call it is. But then the other piece, which you kind of highlighted, is how can you know that they actually obtain that ability to do it, or at least tracking in the right direction of it, right? And if you're a company of 5 and you can observe someone, okay, well, that's great. But I think for the folks here who are probably on the call, they probably are not on a company of 5. They're probably closer to 500 or 5,000. And so just simply watching someone to see if they actually did that thing isn't necessarily like a scalable solution. And so I think those are the types of things that probably have held us back in the past, or made it really difficult to be able to answer some of those questions. Not impossible, but really difficult. And to do that consistently at scale and repeatedly is I think has always been kind of a challenge. But I do think, and I'm sure you'll get into this with some of the work that you guys have done with Natalia and others. I think the technology is bringing us closer to those not necessarily always being limiting factors anymore. And so that's kind of my perspective on it.
Yeah, no, I think you said a couple things there that I really agree with. Those that proven verification of success, for the individual learner. How is this, how do we know that they gain knowledge? How do we know that a skill was developed? And then how was it applied? And then, so after that application, how do we know that the problem was solved, right? So there's kind of like a couple parts there that when you're talking about scaling across large organizations, I don't doubt that this audience is used to this idea of becoming skills based or going on a skills journey. And this is what business leaders are asking for, is what, show me that we can measure and develop skills that, in a way that's scalable as our business changes with technology. So I think, as we think about this, I'd love to just get the audience's perspective, other challenges that they're facing when creating talent initiatives. So there's certainly the amount of time, the amount of resources, technology, scalability. There's a lot that's there, and a lot is put on L&D teams. Natalia, I'm curious from your perspective, right? Especially with the growth in healthcare, just some of the key challenges that your team goes through, and thinking about how all the different areas of your business that you have to work on initiatives for.
Yeah, I curious to see the chat, but I don't think we probably will be unique. I think it's moving fast, and we're moving with sometimes limited resources, and really I think the biggest challenge that we need to solve for is how do we stay very close and connected to the business and solve the business problems with the strategy, the talent strategy, the solutions that we put out there. So I think for me, if I had to define one, is like, how do you stay really connected and answer for business needs with the talent strategy? So that's hard. How do you bring in business with you and be part of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, I saw one in the chat that relates to that too, looking for what is that impact the business is looking for. So staying connected with the business, I think like that's such a key part of that. And like, hey, what are you looking for from an outcome perspective? Time and support, I'm seeing that a lot in the chat, right? Having enough time and enough support. And there's, with technology, there's kind of can't AI just do that, right? Can't we just use AI and then everybody's magically going to know what to do and you'll be able to roll it out very quickly. So I think across the board, is there anything, Al, that you're seeing in the chat that you'd call out as unique or, maybe kind of interesting from your perspective?
No, it's a good. I mean, I think I wouldn't necessarily call this as unique, but I think it's the age-old challenge of just, I'm hearing like some version of buy-in, some version of scalability, also around just being able to manage expectations, and also it looks like also maybe play a little bit of like translation specialist, right? In terms of this
Sure.
is like, Natalia's business leaders come there and say, this is what we want. And Natalia understands, kind of from both a business background, but also a learning and talent background of maybe what's needed. And how do you kind of communicate that back to them in a way that like they understand? Or in some cases, they come in with something that they say that they want. We know that it maybe doesn't make sense or maybe isn't reasonable. And, we could list off all of the reasons why, but, obviously you can't just always just lean into that, right? You have to kind of massage that a little bit and kind of manage that. And so there's just that kind of new translation kind of role that sometimes you have to play to be able to get the result that you want. And so I think those are the, the things. And the last one here is just kind of that age-old problem of this is what leaders want. This is what we think we need. And this is what we know the employee needs. And like, how do you kind of triangulate that, right? And that's always a challenge, right? So.
Yeah, definitely the employee needs piece. And Alyssa, I'm going to call out yours in the chat too, like the recent push for intuitive learning, right? Fewer modules, fewer lessons, those kinds of things. People want to become professionals in their roles. And I think that ties a lot in with immersive learning as well. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here. I think all the CLOs I talk with, everybody, all of our customers, when they talk about, when learning is continuous and proactive and we're not reacting to the latest thing, that's when, people who are professionals in this space really have a chance to shine. That they get to go out and they get to develop something, and it's very thoughtful. You have the time to create something, and it's something that's ongoing. And I know that that reactivity piece can throw everything for a loop, especially with just how fast things are moving in 2025. One of the, I kind of like this chart just because, Natalia, you and I actually had a conversation about this the other day, and in thinking about, what companies can do to keep something continuous. Like, what are the pieces where, anybody who studied operations, you talk about, okay, find the choke point, eliminate that, and then find the next choke point. And I think this idea of, watching learners measurably improve, taking a look at data and then identifying the next problem. So the expectation with organizations isn't that we're going to stop everything and learn something and then you're going to go back to doing the same thing you were doing prior to the training. We know that doesn't work, but we also know that it ends up going in that direction. So, Natalia, for your team, as you think about, kind of this continuant talent and skills development, just in a health system in general, where do you see this like effective, maybe more so in certain functions? Are there areas of the business that do it right to, just because they have to? And, my mind goes to nursing, my mind goes to doctors where, they have to continuously do this piece. But I'm just curious your perspective on it.
Yeah, I think even thinking back a little bit to the question that for the challenges, it's, the training arm has always been an easy button to reach out for any business problem, right? Let's just put a training and then check the box and, things are done. But, the point that you're making here rightfully, and then Al kind of talked about it before, is how do we solve for the right things with the right tools? And then the learning, if it is a solution, which I agree a lot of times, and thank God, right? We all have jobs because of this. It is a solution. But I've lately been thinking a lot about how to separate kind of like the training piece and the learning piece, right? Because if we think about this being continuous process, right? The training helps us, a good, effective training that is scalable, that is very contextual, that is challenging for people, sets very clear expectations around what we train people to do, right? It's very difficult to do around leadership skills, which is my area, right? Because those are kind of soft and very difficult to really define, right? So, but then getting everybody on the same page, what it feels like or what's the right looks like, that's the training piece. And then, you send them out in the workplace, that's learning. That's a lot of learning happens there because you need to implement what you learn. You need to get feedback from people that work with you, your leader, your direct reports, your peers, right? You need to fail fast. You need to do it again, whatever the skill that, again, from my world, the leadership is, yes, we train them on something, but if you think you walk out of the class and you one and done, we know that never happens, right? So the learning has to be going on. And on my end, what I am seeing, and I'm using that lovely data that I'm collecting, right, from the training, which gives me lots of information on where do I need to go next and what is my next pain point that I need to solve for business. So.
There's really, you said a lot there that I really like. And that last piece, though, with the data, and, where do I need to go next? I think, just having worked in technology my whole career, people talk a lot about data on the front end. Mm-hmm. And then when they get the data, they don't really do a lot with it. And, for Al, I mean, how common is that you see, where people are saying like, hey, I've got these really, complete dashboards and I'm collecting all this data and I want individualized learner data and all of this piece that's here. But what kind of, are organizations actually using their data in the way Natalia is talking about, or is she just ahead of the curve?
I think she's probably ahead. I think it's probably a both and. It sounds like she's kind of ahead of the curve, but I think the data is one of the elements that enables you to move from something that is episodic and programmatic to something that is continuous, right? Because when something is continuous, we'll just, for the sake of this argument, say that it is something that is daily or weekly or whatever it is. When something is more programmatic, it's kind of like once a couple months, if that, at best, or in most cases, yearly in something. And so, but you have to have something that's going to enable you to get to the daily or the weekly. And that's where the data kind of comes in, because it informs what that journey is or what the next step is or something like that. And so I think it's critical. I do think that there collectively has been a movement, I would say, or I should say progress over the past maybe decade or so in terms of, I think, a desire to get more data to try to prove some kind of measurement of effectiveness. I think the question you're highlighting, though, is kind of what needs to happen in order for collectively the profession to continue to make progress, which is it's great to capture it, but if you're not going to do anything of it, if you're not going to actually use it to drive a decision of some kind, I think you're just kind of collecting it for the sake of collecting it, which I don't know. I'm not really sure that adds the value that we want. So,
it's funny, like when you think about, collecting it for the sake of proving effectiveness, right? There's almost like the element of like self-preservation in that.
sure.
And then,
Yeah.
done like kind of how you're talking about it, how Natalia is talking about it, when you're thinking about collecting it with the purpose of doing something with it on the front end, that's actually going to get to a place where you can show how effective it is. So it's kind of funny if it's like you're doing just a retrospective, like here's what happened, you're unlikely to prove effectiveness. But if you're going in with, hey, here's what I want to identify, and then how do I show that you've been trained, or how do I show that learning's taking place, I think you're going to get to that place that's effective.
Well, Brian, you may appreciate this, someone being in sales, but one of the things I think about a lot of time is like reasons to call, right? And so like you've got a reason to call your stakeholder when you've got data that says, hey, here's what we're finding based off of the data we have on the skill gaps of your team. Would it make sense for us to have a conversation about how we might be able to close this, right? And so I think that when we do get the right data, it gives us as L&D professionals a reason to call our stakeholders to say, hey, here's what we're seeing in the data. Would it make sense for us to have a conversation? Is this a trend? Is this an insight we might be able to act on to improve the performance, right? And so when we can do that right, like I think for anyone here who did mention something around, one of the challenges being around buy-in, or being around, making sure that, our work gets noticed, or making sure that our work gets prioritized. In many ways, the data can be the missing link, or the thing that enables you to do that.
So Natalia, when you think about working, whether it's stakeholders across your organization, or maybe just the learners themselves, is that something you see that where you'll have access to data, and whether it's, hey, we were able to show something like an effective change, let's move on to the next piece, or, you, the learner, went through this and, you went from A to B in terms of your own journey. Does that kind of help, or maybe just talk a little bit about your experience as far as like using data to get buy-in?
Yeah, well, I'll use the example that I'm sure you're going to move forward in the presentation, and I will work together. I think that's been a very helpful example. So the data that we are seeing, we're seeing a number of things. We're seeing the actual skill growth, right? Like how we're building skills and where people are doing better or worse. But then what we're doing with that data is we can there are different points that we are kind of checking ourselves with our talent strategy. What are we doing next, right? So if we're looking at the skill, so let's take the trust, building trust, which is very kind of difficult to measure. Again, it's a leader skill, right? So we've done a lot of work around trust, and trust behavior was part of the simulation. And we looked at it and we asked the question, okay, we think people should be performing fairly well on that, because given all the things that we've done, so let's see if that's yes or no, right? And we actually did see that trust behavior was pretty well. People were doing pretty well on that one, right, in the simulation. But then we saw some other behaviors that, when we run that data across our engagement scores and our engagement questions, we saw the same gap around leaders not being able to bring in the clarity in the inspirational messages, right? Like early on, to communicate with clarity. So that gives us opportunity. Okay, here's where we're gonna go after that. And what's even better is I work with business leaders from this department or this department, and they ask me, hey, we're having the leadership retreat, and we're going to be talking about what are we doing next as a department, right? And can we look at this data? Yes, we can. And we slice it, and we say, specifically this region and this area in this department, these are the areas that you guys can double down on. And it doesn't necessarily need, like, at this point, complicated learning. It just needs a lot of accountability conversations and coaching and things like that. But so
yeah, I mean, it's nice to give that roadmap, right? Like, especially for, kind of like a leadership meeting context, to say like, hey, here's some very hard data that you can look at. And to your point, it doesn't have to be complex, but if it's actionable, like that's a really big deal. So, I saw some great engagement in the chat. I'd love to get a sense, like just stepping back as, what the most important part of a successful talent strategy is. And I think, the continuous learning piece, I think having data, being mapped to the business, there's a lot here. But, we've got the four choices here. So I'd love to get a poll for sense what the poll looks like. We've got solving the business problem you're tasked with, learners improving their skills, collecting skills data, or creating that culture of continuous learning. And Natalia and Al, I'd love to get what your thoughts are too. Looks like that continuous learning culture that's there. Obviously, all of these pieces are important, right? And I think, you can make a case for any of them. But I'm not surprised at the popularity of letter D.
Yeah.
Oh, very good. All right. So this next piece here, I want to just show, the audience a little bit about what immersive learning looks like at Oshner. So, what we do at Skillwell is we build immersive simulations that give learners the opportunity to be put in a situation where they can make an active decision. And, for a group of L&D professionals, you're all probably familiar with the idea of branching. And, if you're not, kind of think about those little choose your own adventure books and going through and, really determining whether or not somebody has, identified an optimal response. So for a lot of learning, it's, hey, this is a very obvious answer. We try to create a lot of nuance in our simulations where it's, more of a good, better, best. And then from there, we can, kind of dive deep and leverage answers and pathways to see where skill gaps are, need to be filled, and then what learning looks like. So Gary, I'd love if we could just queue up this video and we'll give everybody a chance to see what a snippet looks like. Just as a quick warning, in any time you're using synthetic media, you see something that looks like there's a little bit of a delay there. That it's likely just kind of like a lag in the video, but we can go ahead and kick this off.
This response shared the basics, but lacked enough context. As a result, it caused confusion, frustration, and uncertainty, leaving the team with even more questions. A better approach would be to highlight the leader commitment of honesty by sharing specifics about who will perform which tasks and why. This also promotes the leader commitments of transparency and trust by keeping the focus on purpose and what's best for patients and the team. You go on to explain that based on experience and workload, Luca and Noel will order supplies, and Kira will handle reimbursements. Isaac will no longer have access to the system so that he can focus on process improvement initiatives. After you explain the new roles, Kira still has concerns about no longer doing orders and having less time in her day. How will you reply?
All right, so I'll take a little bit of a step back here, just kind of in thinking about, what that piece looks like. So, Natalia, as you think about kind of leveraging immersive simulation, we saw the coaching character pop up and, give feedback to the learner on, based on what it may be a response that wasn't optimal look like. And, what I love about that particular simulation is, giving kind of a broad overview that's an explanation, right? And so, the learner goes in and they give a response that's maybe not perfect, and here's what you could have done, and here's what's next. You want to talk a little bit about just kind of what that piece looks like for your organization internally as people are putting this through here and their answers. I think everyone's looking at that option A. That's what's next.
And just to make sure, I've checked to make sure the poll's working okay, and it is. It's just that everybody is choosing option A.
Yep, everybody's choosing option A, which is great.
Ah, there we go. Somebody's chosen C.
All right, there we go. All right. I think we can kind of move on and talk a little bit about, just maybe the broader strategy with something like this um, for Natalia and her team. So, I'd love to just, maybe take a little bit of a step back as you think about, specific L&D at Ochsner. You've got this concept called leader commitments, and maybe can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that, where that leadership development focus came into play this year?
Yeah. So I'm going to take us a couple of steps back, and kind of started after the times of COVID with lots of changes, generally happening in the organization and externally, and things that we can't always control that are happening to us from the outside, right? And especially as being the healthcare. And then we also had a change of executive leadership in the organization, which warranted, a review of the strategy, where we're going, how we're going to do it, right? With that, we did a number of assessments, and I put in the chat the question that was about trust. What do we do? We did the Organizational Health Index by McKinsey, and then we looked at some. We do Gallup engagement survey, so there are some of the questions that also correlate to some of the questions from the Health Index, and a few things came from that we need to do something to improve the culture of trust, accountability, and how leaders lead. So the culture topic was put and it was made to be part of the strategy. So the culture and the leadership effectiveness right now is the strategy, right? So the talent is the strategy at Ochsner. And with that, you all know, to get the leader, get right to the teams, and you get the strategy, the strategy is going to be easy, right? So our CEO, Pete November, and a number of other executives kind of worked together and said, hey, let's just identify what are the key leader behaviors that we think are going to allow us to move that strategy forward. And they came up with this, what we call leader commitments. And that's in this point of time of where we are, right, internally and externally, and to move the work that is ahead of us forward. Here are the leader behaviors that we would love all leaders to engage in, right? And so with that, of course, there are a number of pieces. How do we train everyone, provide clarity for everyone, what exactly that looks like, how we do it in a scalable way, in a way that people are actually learning, and then how do we hold people accountable, et cetera, et cetera. And then how do we, continue looking at that data and continue looking how our people are implementing and doing things right in the workplace, and then use that data to inform our further decisions. Where do we develop people? How do we develop them in programs? So that's really, in a nutshell, how we landed in the partnership with, back then, ETU, and now Skillwell. So
very cool. No, thank you for that background. I think it's interesting, like kind of talking about talent as the strategy, right? Like it's a refreshing take, right? Like, because I don't know that everyone is as forward thinking as that, and that's pretty great. And so when you look at something like a 21% skill improvement, I'm curious, how'd that happen?
Yeah. So again, everyone who's done some leadership development, some development around soft skills, so what we call the soft skills, right? It's there are a number of things. It's very difficult to really pinpoint what is the behavior that is that skill, right? Like it's the other difficulty, I think, is the awareness piece. A lot of us as human beings, we're very, very generous to self, right? So if we look at the list of those behaviors, right, like listen actively and treat people with respect, we're like, check, 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 right? I definitely do that. It's always, the initial. And what this partnership and this simulation and this program helped us, it really helped build that self-awareness, because we do ask people how they think they are on each of the skill and ahead of the game, right? And then they go through the simulation, and we'll look at how they actually performed. And there are lots of surprises, and we're reading in the feedback that people are sharing, like, oh, I thought I was better at this. I thought I did this well. And another piece, that going back to the point that, the soft skills are could be fuzzy. This simulation allowed us to create very clear context and to show in a very clear way how do these commitments show up in decision making in your day-to-day activities. So there were a lot of ahas, like, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? So it made the behaviors, the commitments sticky. They just made sense to leaders. So that was helpful.
That is helpful. Al, I'm curious from your perspective. You like, kind of thinking about, like, we all are pretty generous to ourselves, and I know I hear L&D professionals talk about like the confidence versus competence when you're working with large organizations. How often do you get pushback on this idea that some of these soft skills that Natalia's talking about are even possible to measure, right? When just starting from that point, I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Al. No, you go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say,
I want to hear from both of you on this one.
No, I wish people asked for that more. That was my very quick answer. That's what I'll say.
Yeah. No, I think there's definitely pushback. I think that, well, let me say a couple things. So first off, there is an age-old adage of, the fact of, like, you can measure anything, right? Like you truly can. I think what often has held back from measuring soft skills in the past was just the wondering if, like, with what precision we could actually do it, knowing that self-rating is oftentimes aspirational at best versus actually truly being objective. So I would say, in general, yes. I think that in the past there has been a lot of pushback, and it's not even so much pushback, of more just around the lines of, like, how are we going to do that at scale and at efficacy? That's really what the question has been around, and less about, is that even worth it? Like, I think people understand that it could be worthwhile. I think it's just been hard for them to wrap their mind around in what world would we be able to do that with precision and scale. And so I think that's really where it's really been difficult in the past. But I think that's really what's been holding them back the most.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, it's not that it's not possible, just how would we do that, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
like that makes a lot of sense from my perspective. And I think, being able to show data like this for Natalia and your team, I think that's a great place to start. Do you think that the data is allowing you to be a little bit more proactive, right? So as you think about, like, kind of showing, like, hey, we're showing that we can be effective. Like, has that helped you just, kind of in your general strategy of being more proactive when you talked about before some of the leadership meetings, working with stakeholders and things like that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I said, we do that system level, and we do that regionally or by larger departments. Leaders reach out. We report back this data to something that we call the Executive Learning Council, and that's something that we created at Auctioner to bubble up and to talk conversations at the executive level, like, how are we using learning strategically to move the strategy forward, not just for the sake of learning, right? So, because a lot of times there's a lot of competition for lots of stuff coming up. So, bringing that back to the conversation. Okay, so what are we doing this year, next year to actually drive this strategy? What do we need to get everybody on board with, all the leaders or individual contributors or team members, and using that data and to bring in the conversation and saying, hey, we are performing well here. We don't need to spend time more here, but here are some of the gaps that we really need to be continue working on, because it's going to get us in trouble if we don't, right? Because we're not seeing improvement. Maybe it's not the learning next time. Maybe it's an accountability issue. It could be a number of things, but it makes the conversation, I'd say, more meaty and intelligent, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to frame it. We don't need to spend more time here, right? Because I think, any leader would not agree if it was like, well, here's all these areas that need to be worked on. Like that's probably not the case anywhere. And so, like having that credibility, or, just say like, this is the area we don't focus on. The data's telling us we're good. So let's keep our focus over here.
Right.
And I think that makes a ton of sense from my perspective.
As a matter of fact, like what came out of this conversation, we continuously again see that, providing the why, and so what we call behavior, make the why transparent was a problem, right? People keep struggling with that, and now it kind of became a standalone behavior. So what we call the true north behaviors for everyone. We kind of elevating that even more because it seems like we need to do more and better, not just around the learning, but the employee experience is involved, a number of teams that are working on that. But that behavior came out, like the leader commitment simulation was one of the feeder for that. Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that example with the group. That's really great. Al, I want to talk to you a little bit about, kind of some of your foundations, right? You've obviously, you work with a lot of massive companies now, you host a podcast, you're kind of an industry expert. Let's go back a little bit. You've obviously kind of got your start at a couple of really big, well-known companies. Talk to me a little bit about, kind of the foundations, what you learned there that just sort of informed you in terms of what it's like to build out an effective talent strategy at two organizations that are kind of known for it.
Oh, thank you for the question. So I started my career at Deloitte Consulting and Professional Services, and in many ways, the beauty of professional services is that talent is the product, right? And more specifically, the skills and abilities of the collective individuals of the organization are what deliver the outsized value to clients and customers, right? And one of the things I appreciated about my time at Deloitte was that anytime for me personally, I ever wanted to push myself to learn or upskill myself or to take on new skills or abilities, I was always met with eagerness to support and help. And, what I think that taught me was, to the point we were talking about earlier, where Natalia mentioned that talent is the strategy. That is the case and has long been the case in many professional services organizations. And so that was my context and framing of what I thought all businesses were. Now, granted, I was 22 at the time and very naive, but that's my worldview in terms of how I can see how talent drives business outcomes, right? And so my time there really taught me, because of the nature of the business, that even as a leader, like if you can better develop your people, you can put them in positions to take on more work that allows you to take on other responsibilities. And when you have better people who are capable of better things, you can deliver better outcomes. And so that just kind of alignment of that cycle is something that I've taken with me. And, eventually when I would go on to manage my own teams and lead teams, it very much was that ethos of how I approach leadership, of how do I find ways to develop people so that we can collectively win more, and they can develop to take on new things. And so that was the one lesson I learned from there. And then, for my time at Salesforce, I was at Salesforce during a time of pretty rapid change and transformation in terms of just the growth trajectory that was on. And, for me, that was really about how do you kind of lead and navigate change when everything is changing. And it was exciting, right? In many ways, I think a lot of people who go to work at those companies, you kind of come in a little bit clear-eyed about, part of why you sign up to work at a company like that is because it is going through change. But even despite that, it could still be really challenging at times, right? And just with the pace of it and how much it is and how many new people are coming in. But I think in that piece, that what I learned the most there, and which I still take to a time like this today for where we are, is that just two things. Number one, when everything is changing, don't forget to focus on what is staying the same and really finding those moments of stability, because stability helps, particularly it helps calms us down in moments of uncertainty and ambiguity. And particularly as a leader, showing stability during times of uncertainty can be really valuable to your people. But then the other piece of it was really on the learning piece, again, of if you can be the person who tends to learn or tries to learn and lean into the change that's happening, there are always opportunities on the other side of that. And so, I mean, there's a lot of other lessons, but those are a couple of the main ones that I've taken with me, and certainly tried to embody in the work that I do and how I show up each and every day.
Yeah, you know, and like kind of thinking back to that time at Deloitte, right? And you know, obviously it's similar to something that Natalia said, where it's, you know, like the people are the product, right? And so, you know, kind of this, we're going to invest in those people. You know, you fast forward to now, you're obviously working with a lot of really large companies,
Yep.
and you know, kind of taking that philosophy. Is that something you try to bring to them? You know, kind of both your idea of
Yeah.
like how we do it through change management, but then also like this broader philosophy of like, hey, your people are the product, whether you know it or not. Like, how do we invest in that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's definitely something I look for in terms of the clients I try to work with, but also yes, in terms of, you know, there's some of the approaches that I share. You know, I think that part of sometimes how this marinates is, you know, I think a lot of times we tend to look at work based off of kind of what we've done in the past, and a lot of what we've done in the past is how do we kind of allocate, you know, the right tasks to the right people to make the trains run on time and to kind of work in an effective and efficient way. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think to a certain degree, you kind of need that within an organization. But the other side of that is the growth side, right? In terms of, you know, the growth and being able to create value in new ways. And a lot of times that comes from novel and complex kinds of things, not just repetitive and rote kind of things,
Sure.
right? So to get to that other side, though, you kind of have to think differently about how you lead or how you manage people. And so part of, you know, the conversation a lot of times really, you know, in those moments is around, you know, well, what is the business goal that you're trying to achieve here, right? And you know, if you are in a situation where you are, you know, given a mandate to grow, or you are put in a position where you're asked to take on a new challenge or initiative or something that doesn't necessarily have a playbook for, it can't just be about repetitive roteness or rote things and being efficient. Like at some point, you've got to think differently about how you approach your people. And so that is often an entree in, as well as just, you know, given the time that we're in, you know, right now, where there is a lot of change and uncertainty, again, learning can be the antidote, right? And all of that in terms of being able to create, you know, opportunities as well as to be able to drive results, right? And so most importantly, and so, you know, the conversation a lot of times really starts at a higher level, just around, you know, what are you trying to achieve right now in the broader kind of macro environment, and then kind of getting down to how some of these tools kind of come in place. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, you know, thing to think about too, because as we think about, you know, from just the conversation around technology and humans right now, I think, you know, I think there's probably another layer to this dimension that combines both of them. But you know, maybe that's a different conversation for a different day.
And I think it's a conversation a lot of people are having, right? You know,
Yeah.
as they think about this and they think about how to scale and how do we make the best use of our people, the best use of technology. You know, a lot of what organizations will talk to us about is very much that piece of like, okay, you know, we want to make sure that we're not training people to do things that are repetitive. Like we want to find a technology solution for that piece where, you know, we can leverage our human capital in a way where they're doing things that are valuable. It's not,
Yeah.
hey, we're looking to get rid of people. It's like we're looking to deploy our people as effectively as we can. And so, like, you're right. That's a big conversation, but I think it's one that organizations should be having.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, you know, we're getting close to kind of wrapping up a little bit, and you know, we've talked about a lot of different things. And Natalia, I kind of see you in the chat talking a little bit about some of the ways that you know, built out some of the simulations with us. You know, thinking about this idea of making learning continuous. I'd like to come at it from like a little bit of a different lens, right? Like, you know, how do you get buy-in from learners, right? You know, in this idea of making learning continuous, and I think there's a lot of people out there that are really passionate about something, and you know, they'll kind of go after and follow their passion for that, but you know, kind of getting them bought into this idea of like being passionate about learning. I guess you know, what are ways that people can, you know, kind of go back to their teams with something actionable today, Al, from your perspective, that you know, kind of help them on this journey? Just any ideas from, I guess, either of you, like ways that people can, you know, take back something, you know, and making learning more continuous as part of their philosophy. I'd love to just hear, you know, something that you guys would think that even just a small change where that could be helpful.
I think what we would like to see and we're striving for is to have more larger cross-functional teams, I guess. Again, bringing that idea to solve for business needs, right? Because again, learning doesn't always happen in the shape of the training, right? So the learning continues to happen in the workplace. So bringing in folks from the performance team, because there is always accountability, right? Bringing teams that do coaching, bringing teams that solve for technical issues and things of that nature. So it's bringing the regional leadership for the conversations and the accountability conversations and feedback. I think what I'm trying to say is it's not just hours. It's learning has to be a part of culture, and then it becomes continuous, right? Like you see every problem as a learning opportunity. That's when it really is continuous, right?
Yeah. I see some applause for that. Every problem is a learning opportunity. I agree with that. Al, any other thoughts on continuous learning?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think this is aligned to some of what Natalia is talking about. But if you think about it just from a pure kind of hours in the day perspective, your employees spend far more time not with you as a leader in learning than they do with you. And so to the degree that you want to make this something that's continuous, I think the question becomes if that like constraint is true, well, how do you find more ways to meet them where they are? Right. And I think inevitably, once you realize that what the downstream implication is that you probably can't do this alone. Because again, there are far more people that don't work in learning than in your organization than people that do. And so I think the answer or the implication for all of you, and I think this aligns a little bit with what Natalia's saying, is like, how do you find more ways to go out into the organization and to either find other people who are trying to achieve a similar objective, but maybe they use a different tool. Maybe they don't use the language of learning, but it's what they need. Because again, it's going to be hard for you to do it alone anyway. And so might as well enlist them and bring them on board. And before you bring them on board, like you may have to do some listening, right? You may have to go out there a little bit, but even that in and of itself, I think is a valuable activity just so that they can know who you are. Because that is also what gets you called into the room more and more, because when more people know about the types of problems that you're trying to solve and the types of capabilities that you have, that's when they're going to be like, oh, okay, maybe we can involve Natalia's team or whatever it is. And so that would be my advice, is to kind of go out into the organization and start being curious about what are the objectives that people are trying to achieve, or what are the problems that they're trying to solve.
I like that. I think one thing I see with our, a lot of the clients we work with too, that I always appreciate is when sometimes they'll take a look at like, here's what somebody else has done, right? Like, and thinking about like, hey, if you're working on building out that culture of continuous learning, kind of looking to one of those aspirational organizations, whether it's somebody you compete with or just somebody that you admire, and what happens when you make learning continuous and what the results look like. I think that's oftentimes a really good place to start, is like, hey, we can do this here too. This is what our team can do, and just showing people sort of the art of the possible. I know that's a big thing for a lot of different people, of like, people can learn, they can upskill, they can do these things, and it just takes kind of the right investment and the right attention that's paid to it. And oftentimes it's like, seeing somebody at the end of the journey, maybe get somebody excited about kind of starting at the beginning.
And I think, Ryan, to this end, I think a lot of times we have a tendency, at least, we do, and which we're trying to overcome, is like go large and everyone, like make learning continuous for everyone. And I think like really zooming out and saying, okay, what is absolutely a critical group for that we need to make learning continuous, right? That's leadership, for example, for us. So how can we focus on that group to make a priority for them to make a part of leadership culture, right? Because then it becomes a little more realistic for us to go after that, right? And then leaders, again, having the right leaders is absolutely key. Then they can, spread the love of continuous learning, and they could treat the problems as learning opportunities, time and time again. So that's.
I think that's right on. I like that a lot. And like you said, it's, it's unlikely you're going to get day one buy-in across the board, and kind of taking that approach to it, I think will create kind of like a snowball effect too, where, it'll just grow larger and larger. I know we're kind of coming up on time here. I want to do a quick plug for us here at Skillwell. So we actually, as part of our rebranding, we talked about being ETU previously. We launched our newest version of our simulation platform, and with that, it allows instructional designers, training practitioners, the ability to build an immersive simulation very quickly. And so as you think about kind of building that continuous loop, one of the areas that we're really excited about, we build out programs that are very sophisticated, like what we've done with Natalia and her team, and you can kind of leverage that data and build an immersive simulation that's a lot faster for a smaller group. So, maybe this isn't something that's rolled out to everybody, maybe it is, but it's something you can leverage that data to help make learning continuous. So if you want to check out the link, I know Austin just put it in the chat for our new platform. We'd love for you all to take a look. I think, as we kind of wrap up here, we've done a pretty good job by answering questions in the chat. Any final thoughts? I'll kind of start with Al. Anything else you want to just sort of leave for the group before we end for today?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think where I'll leave you is kind of where we left off with that last question, right? I think that there is an opportunity, I think, for everyone who's here to be able to elevate the impact of their work, whether it's through better data, whether it's through trying to validate skills and in a more objective and sustainable way. And so, but I think it all starts with, at least for me, with, getting curious and going out to the stakeholders that matter to you and being curious about the problems that they're trying to solve and the objectives they're trying to achieve and seeing where you can kind of slot in. And so that would be where I would leave you all on my end.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan. And where can people find your podcast and where can they reach out to connect with you?
Thank you. You can find my podcast, The Edge of Work, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. My name is Al and the last name is DEA, and would love to connect with anyone.
Awesome. Thank you. Natalia, you had a request in the chat for a quote that you had. I'm not going to try to get it myself. I'm just, in thinking about learning as an opportunity. I don't know if you want to get to that, but I guess any other thoughts that you want to leave this group with?
Yeah, no, I read that and I was like, I don't know. Is that something that I said, the quote? I
think you said it. I think you did say.
You did,
okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can reproduce that, but I think if we treat everything as a learning
we'll get the recording. Yeah, there you go. Treating everything as a learning.
Yeah, I think that's and it has to be part of culture. Yes,
yes. Thank you, Lindsay.
Austin said we'll get the clip out too. Thank you. All right. Well, hey, I want to thank you both. This was a really great conversation. Thank you to the audience. We really enjoyed this. Gary, thank you to you for facilitating this great conversation. This is really great. Please check out Al. We'd love for you to check out us. And Natalia, thank you so much for kind of bringing your expertise to this conversation today. I hope you all have a great rest of your Tuesday. And as we gear up for the holidays, hope you have a great holiday as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I will thank you, Ryan, and Skillwell. Thank you so much. I want to help everybody visit Skillwell. So if it pops up on your screen, you are all set to request a demo or take a tour or whatever. And if it doesn't, you just need to let your pop-up blocker know that you'd like to see that. If you didn't get a chance to download the handout, let me know in the chat and I'll make it available to you. But otherwise, we'd love to know what you took away from today's session over there in the takeaways. Not so much the thank yous there, but what ideas really resonated with you, or what do you think you will think about further if not implement right away? Okay, you can click on that. Oh no, you can't. Never mind that. Also, I see that some folks have put down some answers to the question, what other topics would you like to learn about in the future? What can Skillwell or anybody else at Training Magazine Network help you with further? So thanks for rating the session, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Austin for your help, and Ryan and Natalia and Al for being here and for doing a great session. So thank you so much. We'll look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Again, we have some great webinars coming up in the next few days. So be sure and visit the webinar calendar. Thank you very much, Jessica, and anybody else who lists some takeaways. For now, I'll say goodbye, and but I'll leave the session open and for you to type and think about. And if you need some help from me, if you didn't catch how to make a transcript or how to download a transcript, I should say, and you want some help with that, let me know. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Have a great day.